I think I'm going to get started now. My name is Melanie Yeung. I am representing Continua Health Alliance today and PCHA Alliance on this talk. My day job is with a research group at University Health Network in Toronto. We are actually a network of 4 hospitals: Toronto General, Toronto Western, Princess Margaret Cancer Centre, and Toronto Rehab. We are the largest institution in Canada for any medical research, and also affiliated with University of Toronto. My background, I'm a clinical engineer. I've been a member of PCHA Alliance and Continua for multiple years, as well as the IEEE Personal Health Device Working Group, co-authoring the insulin pump standard and the CGM standard for diabetes management. CGM, sorry, for those who don't know, is continuous glucose monitor. I am also a member of the Bluetooth Medical Device Expert Working Group. So we deal within the Bluetooth organization those protocols related to medical devices. So devices these days are now incorporating Bluetooth technologies so that we could wirelessly transfer information and data from these medical devices to gateways, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I'm a manager to an awesome development team. So what we've done and the role that we've played is that we wanted to create applications and systems, solutions for chronic disease management. And that's how we got involved with interoperability and some of these different working groups and standards, is because our developers were fed up with trying to integrate devices that our patients and providers wanted to use in these solutions. And so we used a user-centered design approach, and one of those demands was to wirelessly transmit or connect to these devices and use the data for the purpose of disease management. And so this is just a couple of pictures of some of the work we've done in diabetes and in heart failure. And I'm going to go into describing some of the other use cases that we could do in the medical and healthcare system to using device data. So what can you expect from this tutorial? This is a part 2 kind of tutorial. Todd Cooper, Todd at the back. If you didn't catch his session earlier today, I believe the slides are available. And so this is a continuation with a more focused look on personal health devices. And I'll give you a little bit introduction of what Personal Connected Health Alliance is, the standards that are involved, and Continua design guidelines. Specifically, we're here. It's called FHIR DevDays. We want to look at what that linkage is between the design guidelines and the device standards, and the FHIR, the emerging FHIR standard. And finally, I think the best use of a tutorial is always to get real-world experience. I'm going to walk through a real use case and kind of show you how these device data can be integrated both at home with the patient as well as the provider in the hospital or clinic setting. So let's get started. So Personal Connected Health Alliance is an organization, nonprofit, that connected 3 different groups. Connected Health Conference, which is actually an annual conference held here in Boston. And it is also, formally known as the mHealth Summit, dedicating its topics around research in mHealth and mobile health and technology. Continua Design Guidelines, or Continua Health Alliance, is also part of this PCHA Alliance. And its main focus was to look at a technical framework, a design guideline for implementation of interoperability standards. And so collectively, the Connected Health Conference, Continua, and also HIMSS formed the Personal Connected Health Alliance. So the guidelines themselves are actually implementation guides, reference guides that is a collection of documents. This is the end-to-end architecture here. So what we touch upon is everything from the, on your left-hand side, to the personal health devices, which are things like a blood pressure monitor, like a glucose meter, like a temperature, like a weight scale. These are all what's considered a personal health device, or PHD. And then we have things that connect it to services such as a conduit like a phone, a computer, a gateway, a hub. These are called personal health gateways. These help devices, medical devices, communicate out to other systems. And then, of course, we have what we designate the health and fitness services. So these are systems that help with remote patient monitoring, for example, solutions that help with chronic disease management, and lots of other data representations. So all of these guidelines are actually supported by the United Nations ITU, which is a telecom union that has supported the guidelines. And you can find these under the H.810 guidelines. There's about 5 of them, 811, 812, 813, and then there's sub-documents as well describing individually those guidances for which standards to use, what security frameworks you need to ensure that there is proper security measures for the data to be transferred between these different systems. So why has Continua chosen FHIR as one of its supported standards? There was a lot of demand from developers, as most of the demand for FHIR is because a lot of the old systems around HL7 version 2 and things like PCD01 was very difficult, especially for app developers and emergent technologies. So having that combination of health data, but using things like JSON, OAuth, HTTP, REST, and some of those more familiar software development and app development technologies, this was a way for Continua to kind of incorporate these newer thinking for this Health 2.0 movement. So we want to enable an ecosystem of apps and devices and cloud-enabled services to provide the best care for providers and patients. It's easy to develop and test applications due to the availabilities of open source. You can see the number of attendees here and the number of supporters that are around the Argonauts projects, for example, a lot of the open source movements. My co-manager, James Agnew, with a Happy FHIR server, for example. These are all things that build a community around this data. And FHIR as a data model has tons of use cases that support remote patient monitoring, which is something that Continua is really focused on. So in 2017, we released a guideline around HL7 FHIR, and this could be found on the PCH Alliance website. And again, all these slides and links are going to be available after the talk so that you can take a look at some of the documents that are embedded within. So Continua, again, looking at enabling patient-generated data from medical devices, from to personal health gateways like your phone, a mobile app, but beyond that to the electronic health records, to the hospital information system, to other services and solutions that could enable better healthcare support. And some of the use cases are things like diabetes. Okay, managing your diabetes, using things like a glucose meter to test your blood glucose levels at home, a continuous glucose monitor, which is a subset of a blood glucose meter, which actually is, reporting 5-minute or sometimes even 1-minute interval data about how your glucose levels are. Insulin pumps, injecting insulin and delivery of insulin directly for a patient patient and having that ability to even control sometimes some of the parameters. And we're working towards an automated system where we're mimicking a pancreas, which is called an artificial pancreas, which is basically combining some of these different devices in a closed loop fashion, using the data between all these different sensors to actually automate the delivery of insulin based on your glucose fluctuations. So some really interesting work here in diabetes. Hypertension, hypertension is one of those chronic diseases that there is no symptoms. It's asymptomatic. A lot of the times patients do not know that they have high blood pressure or hypertension, but the consequences of persistent hypertension is detrimental and a ton of complications that result in hypertension. Heart failure, we work very closely with our cardiac center at the Toronto General Hospital to look at ways to keeping patients at home and managing their heart failure. Heart failure is not a curable chronic disease. It's something that you can be diagnosed and if you're lucky, be able to receive a transplant. But on a day-to-day management system, you can regulate with medication and other activities and treatment plans your levels of weight fluctuation, which is the direct relationship to your cardiac output and how much your heart can pump your blood across your body. COPD or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease as well. And so these are just some examples of major chronic diseases that Continua is looking to support. And what we do is we bring in these types of use cases and try to drive the development of standards and find standards that support these devices to then address these chronic disease use cases. So remote patient monitoring is also a hot topic, and we as a healthcare system needs to find more ways to keep people at home. It's extremely expensive, and as you heard from Dr. Halamka this morning, that it's extremely expensive when a patient enters the hospital in the ER and get admitted to the ICU. We're talking about $10,000, $20,000 per night stay, for example, for all the resource and intense equipment that is needed at the hospital. If we start to shift to the home environment by enabling people to bring home devices and to connect to the hospital in different means through this interoperability ecosystem, we can hopefully prevent people from entering the emergency room and staying for long periods of time in ICU and as an inpatient. So there are certain requirements, though, that remote patient monitoring needs. For example, people are demanding automatic device-reported vital signs, so automatically transferring data. I don't want to be manually entering my blood pressure or my glucose value every time that I need to take it, for example. But we have to support manual entry as well. We may take it episodic, so in the morning every day, or when I'm feeling unwell, for example. It could be waveform. We can give a patient a Holter monitor or an ECG patch that they are wearing, for example. And so these are some of the devices that need to be supported as well in terms of collecting waveform data versus numeric. Association with a proper patient, and this is big because a lot of these devices are very simple. I have no way of identifying myself to this device today. And so as we look into the resources and the FHIR resources that are required to send some of this information, we need to be able to identify these patients in certain ways out of band or outside of the medical devices so that we can transfer that information to the appropriate record. The delivery of measurements. A lot of these devices, or some of these devices, have now the capabilities to storing history. So 10 days worth of data before you can upload it. So how do we treat that bulk upload of data to the record? Installation and configuration of equipment could be a requirement. single and personal, multi-users, weight scales. Everyone, you have one weight scale in the bathroom, but multiple family members could be using it. What does that mean? What are the challenges around there? And so let's get going into the specific use case that we've chosen, which kind of incorporates both at-home care and at the hospital. And so we chose a pregnancy disorder use case called preeclampsia. And I'm going to just walk you through a clinical scenario. So Annie is a 31-year-old female. It's her first pregnancy. She has asymptomatic hypertension, which means that you have high blood pressure, and proteinuria, which means that you're leaking proteins in your urine, and this is detected by a urine stick, okay, a dipstick. She delivered a 7 pounds, 5 ounce baby boy, but she had to be induced for labor. The infant was delivered without complication and healthy with an AGPAR score of 8 and 9, and they were transitioned to a postpartum ward and were discharged to home on hospital day 2. So this is the general use case that we're going to kind of walk through. So the initial diagnosis was, at first she was going to her prenatal visits. She peed on a stick, a dipstick. It detected that it was high proteinuria. Every 6 hours, she was asked by her doctor to measure her blood pressure using a blood pressure monitor at home. So the combination of high blood pressure and high protein in the urine makes preeclampsia. The consequences of preeclampsia could be as detrimental as loss of child and loss of mother, as well as seizures, and this could be instantaneously. So Annie was asked to take her blood pressure at home every 6 hours, and so far so good. At initial start, she was measuring 98/65 and the normal range. On the 4th day, however, as she was following her treatment, she spiked to 142/90, okay? What we could do with this spike, and if we had that device integration, that data can be analyzed by a clinical decision support tool. So a threshold measure. Anything above 130, for example, could notify an alert. You can use this data to create an SMS text message reporting that it's starting to spike high. Change your regimen from 6 hours to every 3 hours. So we can message her through other means, through an app notification, through a text message, that now we're starting to monitor more closely your condition. So following these readings, the clinical decision support concludes that Annie should begin starting taking her blood pressure even more closely every 2 hours. Over the next 48 hours, Annie records this by taking her blood pressure. It starts to trend up. It continues to go. And again, using the data, we can start analyzing historical data and looking for trends. CDS concludes that it's not looking good. She's spiking high. She's continued to go high. Let's go and notify her and her provider and bring her from the home into the hospital because there is a risk to the patient and baby. Upon admission, Annie is monitored every hour using a hospital physiological monitor. So she's no longer using this PhD device or personal health device, but what is called a point of care device, which Todd spoke to you. So it is the same type of measurement. It's a blood pressure, but now instead of a home device or a PhD, we're now using a multi-parameter physiological monitor that encompasses a blood pressure. This also is then sent to the same clinical decision support. The new monitor also confirms that she's spiked high, and we now can administer or recommend medication to that patient. Once she's done taking the oral medication in the next 48 hours, her monitor now drops back to a normal range, and she's now discharged and recommended to use her home monitoring blood pressure once again. And so what I'm trying to describe to you is a typical use case from home to hospital and back to home, okay? And we are traversing this data through these different systems, but we need to enable this data to be collected in such a way that is consistent in a manner that the clinical decision support tool, the provider, and the patient is all aware of the risks involved with using the data. So if we look at the Continua end-to-end architecture, again, what we see is all the different devices that can be supported on the personal health devices. And what we're saying is, there are certain standards that we can use and conform to and test against and certify against. Things like the 11073 IEEE standards and Bluetooth standards as well. And so things like a non-invasive blood pressure monitor could have in its firmware these different protocols so that it can connect to a gateway system and you can switch out. So if you have multiple different types of blood pressure and different manufacturers, but they all communicate the same, right? We can interchange and there's interoperability of these devices, but we're all capturing the same device data. And in what's really important is in the same semantics, okay? So we have the same understanding that a systolic pressure value is the contraction of the heart. A diastolic pressure is a relaxation of the heart. The mean arterial pressure, and again, the units of measures that these data elements are being transmitted. So this is a very simple example of the type of data that we're trying to standardize. And through those means, we can use and utilize groups like Bluetooth SIG, for example. So this organization is those who has a phone that connects to their car through Bluetooth. Same organization. Okay, so the audio and car group, working group, will deal with that. But what we're trying to say is, how do we enable medical devices now to use the same Bluetooth protocols and also transmit it to very consumer-friendly devices like a smartphone that also has a Bluetooth radio? So Bluetooth low energy, I'm not going to go into it specifically, but you can find more on the Bluetooth SIG website. But there's a model that they follow, and there's different services and characteristics, which are the attributes that a device could contain. And so these are the data elements that we need to map to FHIR or to other standards so that we have that seamless transmission of data. The IEEE is another organization that develops protocol, communication, application layer standards. And they do it through a domain information model. So in Todd's talk this morning, he talked a little bit about how the representation of a device is done through the MDS. That describes the system as a whole. The individual observations could be separated out into things like a numeric or a metric object. And this is how we start to parse out all the different data elements that are composed inside a device. And so there's lots of devices that are supported by IEEE or have IEEE specialization. I mentioned a few of them being like weight scale, temperature, urine analyzer, continuous glucose monitor, insulin pump. Those are all standardized in 11073. And then there are also Bluetooth profiles as well. And so why are we doing this? And again, it's to transfer all this device, not so it sits on someone's phone, but we can also communicate it out to other information systems. We want to reuse the data model that comes from the medical device. We want to also keep up with the evolving technology like app development and clinical decision support and AI and machine learning and research purposes. Our lifecycle process is designed to extend and be agile. So we want to start using FHIR because we feel like this is going to be the next movement to getting this medical device data into the hands and into the systems that need it. So what are the exact resources that are being mapped? So we use a bundle of resources and three main resources. It's the patient, the device, and the observation resource. And those are the only three that we really need to have. And so the medical device system is directly mapped to the device resource. The metric and numeric objects in the domain information are all in observation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the patient as well, because that is outside of a typical PhD or personal health device. And we'll need to have more understanding of how creative and different solutions we can use to identify a patient so that we can use the FHIR bundle. So if we look at specifically the blood pressure in the 11073 world, we've got the MDS going to the device resource, the systolic, diastolic, and mean, for example, going to an observation that contains components of those three numerics. And then we've got the pulse or the heart rate that we can also map to another observation resource and capture that data element there. So, like I said, FHIR requires a patient resource so that it could appropriately send that information to the right record. The availability, though, is challenging for personal health devices. Again, a glucose meter or a blood pressure monitor or a weight scale, a lot of these devices don't have a means to actually capture who you are at that time. So we need to figure out another way to actually identify that patient who's stepping on the scale. Privacy is also something that's important. These are regulated medical device under FDA or other regulatory bodies, right? Personal health information has never typically been within the medical device for PhDs. And so how do we protect the personal health information that is traveling in the public network, right, when we're sending this type of data? And so we need to find out-of-band means to actually connect the data with the device data. So managing the patient identity, there are a couple of ways that we do this. What we can use is to actually obtain the logical ID of the patient resource from the personal health gateway. So for example, if a smartphone application is your personal health gateway, is there a way to identify the person ahead of the device capturing so that we can then forward the collective bundle with the patient and the medical device data through a FHIR server, for example. So that we can walk through, but I think I'm running a little bit out of time for that. Again, the details of the patient resources can be found in these slides as well as the implementation guide. So I'm just going to quickly go through this. The device resource. Okay, so this is brand new. We are no longer using the device component resource as of 2 months ago, Todd? Yesterday? Days and weeks. So previously in the 2017 talk, we were exploring device component resource to capturing all the MDS, the medical device system information, like hardware, software version, what specialization you're using, and all of the device type related information. This is now all done in the device resource. So system ID, device type, product specification, and we're working through those details and the implementation details as we speak. So very much hot off the topic for this evolving guidance. Finally, the observation resources. The most important is the nomenclature and the semantics. Like I said, we want to make sure that the blood pressure that you receive at home is mapped to the same blood pressure you're receiving at the hospital. How we're doing it is we're using the same nomenclature codes. And we can define those codes, and they're all mapped together in an electronic system called RTMMS. Okay, so all of these individual data elements, as simple as systolic blood pressure has a code, diastolic blood pressure has a code, and we're using that across both at-home PhD devices and in the hospital POCD devices. And so the way that you code it inside the FHIR resource is actually through a codable concept. And so what you would do is describe the 11073 nomenclature code, which is also known as the 10101 standard, and then you'll provide that value. We also, as part of the FHIR resource and observation resource, have to also align it with the LOINC code, okay? So it's a combination of both the 10101 and the LOINC code within the observation resource. So just showing an example, it's kind of small on the screen, apologies for that. We are profiling this bundle to be calling it PCH Alliance, and we can create the category, for example. These are typically vital signs as the category. We are coding them both in the nomenclature 10101 standard as well as the LOINC in combination. And we are using observation components as well to actually describe each of the data value like systolic, diastolic, and mean, all within the observation resource. So in summary, what we need to do is to ensure and preserve that data from the personal health device is that a gateway should map to the same nomenclature, both from 11073 and from a Bluetooth profile to a FHIR resource, one of three. Gateway is expected to use either JSON or XML when uploading a measurement, while the server shall support both, okay? Server shall expose FHIR capabilities, and of course the security is OAuth 2. Gateway shall use client credentials and resource or owner credentials, and we talked a little bit about the patient resource, and other authorization codes and security measures, again, to preserve that integrity of that data. So we recently released also an implementation guide. This is on a website that can be found on hl7.org. Here you can see all of the different implementation documents, and you can walk through different use cases as well, similar to what I did with the pregnancy use case. And you could see how we can take these three resources from the devices to a FHIR server. So what's next for Continua and FHIR? We're working on FHIR retrieval APIs. We're going to continue to look at profiling for PROMs, or patient-reported outcome measures. And we're also looking at devices that don't connect to a gateway, but directly to a services interface. So Internet of Things, embedding certain radio chips inside the devices itself so that it can communicate directly to a FHIR server. So these are some of the next steps, and I welcome you guys. I have a little demo around hypertension and blood pressure monitoring. We've got sample apps that you can download so that you could try it at home and upload it to your own FHIR server. There are a lot of test servers out there, and so you can specify and start seeing that transaction between the Bluetooth device to a gateway to a FHIR server. And we're upstairs at a table if you want to come and complete an exercise around the pregnancy use case. And that's where I'm going to stop for any questions about Continua or the standards.
Has there been any, has anybody thought through adherence devices?
So Michael is representing PCHA Alliance. So yes.
And also interoperability, because there is adherence monitor, one of those 16 protocols, something you could read. Anyway, yeah, adherence monitor comes starting in Continua as well. And it requires
Those incorporate like the medication resource or
the medication.
So if you guys didn't hear, it was around a medication dispensing or adherence device. And so that is one of the 11073 specializations. Yeah, anything else? Questions? Yes.
do you have examples of cases where you implemented the solution? Or do you use specific devices?
So there are a lot of examples of gateways that are Continua compliance, for example. The one that I'm going to show in iDemo is by an affiliate company called LNI. They've created gateways that receive, it's a generic manager. So anything that's supporting 11073, for example, it can consume those information models and then send them to a FHIR server. So yes, there are a couple of examples out there. Yeah.
We also have what's called device FHIR, FHIR. That is apps on both Play Stores and Android and iOS. You're welcome to get the demo of the work of Continua compliance.
Now, we're just trying to understand how, are we close to the example that you showed in terms of the data that was that a real example?
Absolutely. So let me just side note. I'm going off track, off slide. This is the system that we give to our heart failure patients, okay? It is supporting FHIR. It has an interface with for patients that are looking for congestive heart failure. Embedded in the app itself is an algorithm, a rules-based algorithm, an expert system that looks at the weight measurement, the blood pressure measurement that come in from Bluetooth, for example. It records a manual entry of a patient's symptoms. Collectively, it could determine whether or not the patient needs to take diuretics, Lasix, and it will message automatically to the patient through an alert saying, take 40 milligrams of diuretics, your weight has spiked 3 pounds greater, that is your delta range that your physician has prescribed. The system will also send an alert to a cardiologist to notify that this patient has taken more Lasix. And if they want to follow up, they could see it on a web interface that is also FHIR based. And so these systems are coming. As we build and collect more data, again, we're a bit a ways away around big data and machine learning and AI, but eventually when we get enough information, we can connect this to genomic data, profiling patients based on their gene sequencing for those different treatment plans. So it's around the corner, and there's a lot of possibilities, a lot of use cases that can be supported with device data. And again, artificial pancreas. A lot of people are now connecting these devices together in closed loop format so that we're one step closer to managing diabetes for type 1 diabetes patients who require insulin support. Yeah.
Very simple implementation of this because we've already established mechanism through machine learning and stuff. They already devised mechanism based on patients' vitals. We already generate alerts to the PCHA and stuff. We're just looking for another platform where users can input data. So we've already implemented a third-basic layer. So you can manually go and input. The next step would be to create an interesting device, like Bluetooth-enabled device. So it's a simpler solution. I'm just looking for one more entry point for users.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are more and more devices that are becoming Continua compliant. Every year there's a certification process that device manufacturers go through to certify that their devices comply. And so as we start to see these devices being realized and being produced by manufacturers, you could have that interplay. You could develop your gateway or a PhD to support a Continua compliant device, and then you do it once. And then you can get, different manufacturers' devices that connect automatically. That's the beauty of interoperability, right? Is when everyone starts to standardize, you now have choice for the patient.
You work at ACO, which bears the cost of the payer, and they're trying to educate their patients, saying that you need to get more blood pressure, but you report to us, and based on that, we do analysis, and then we alert the ACO care provider. So, once we integrate this system, we have more data for the care provider to analyze the patient.
Yeah, and a lot of this as well is, the accuracy of the data. Not just the ease of use for, like, let's say Bluetooth technology, but a lot of the times that people with hypertension will lie about what their hypertension values are, right? Because they don't want to, trigger an alert or tell their clinician, right? So when you do manual entry, you could potentially lie both ways. Some patients want to avoid their clinicians. Other patients actually want to try to alert more so they get calls from their clinician, right? So through this type of interoperability as well and doing this, data transfer from the devices directly, you're going to eliminate, transcription errors or false values. You're going to get that data directly from the medical device. Any other questions? Great, so I'd like to invite you guys all to our table to explore, download the app. I believe it's available on Android and iOS for the device on FHIR one. And I only have one blood pressure monitor, but feel free to come take your blood pressure and see it in FHIR. Thanks.